Good evening. This is Mr. Evans. We are still reading Child of the Silent Night by Edith Fisher Hunter, and tonight we are starting with Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called Another Stranger. As he rode his horse back to college that evening, James Barrett could think of nothing but Laura Bridgman. He did not hear the robins singing their late cheerio cheer-ups. He did not see the apple blossoms that covered the orchard trees so that there seemed to be great vases of flowers along the road. He did not smell the blossom-laden lilac bushes that stood by the farmhouse doors as he rode past. For the time being, it was almost as if he too were deaf and blind and dull of senses. His thoughts were so busy with Laura Bridgman. Of course she is becoming more and more disobedient, thought James Barrett to himself. She is so bright and so interested in things that she cannot be easily held back. She knew that those were her very own treasures, and that little John would spoil them. She disobeyed her father because she cared so much about them. If only she could tell people what she wants and why she does things. But she can't. She probably never can. Even a night's sleep did not entirely clear James Barrett's mind of such thoughts. He went to his first class at college in the morning, only half prepared in his lessons and not able to concentrate on what the teacher was saying. The class was one in anatomy, the study of the human body, and the teacher was Dr. Reuben Mussey. Dr. Mussey was one of James Barrett's favorite teachers, and it suddenly occurred to James that Dr. Mussey might be interested in hearing about Laura. After the class was over, he told Dr. Mussey all about Laura Bridgman. He was glad to be able to share his enthusiasm and concern for this remarkable little girl with someone outside the family. "I just wish that you would come out to the Bridgman farm with me sometime, sir, and see her for yourself. It is just amazing to me that she knows as much as she does." "Well, James," said Dr. Mussey, "I would indeed be very much interested in seeing this child. You know how much I feel we have still to discover about the human body and mind, and how they work. But do you think that the Bridgmans would welcome my coming? They might think I was just curious." "I believe that Mr. Bridgman would be most happy to have you come, especially if he thought that you might be able to help in some way. After all, he knows how difficult it is to make Laura obey him now. He knows he needs help." "I wish that I thought I really could be of some assistance," said Dr. Mussey, "but I doubt that there is anything much that can be done for such a child. Your enthusiasm makes me want to see her, however, if you are sure that no one will mind my coming." "Well," said James Barrett, "I can't truthfully say that no one will mind. Mr. and Mrs. Bridgman won't, I'm sure, but Mr. Tenney will probably mind a good deal." And James Barrett told Dr. Mussey all about Laura's wonderful but suspicious friend. Professor Mussey was very much interested in what James Barrett told him about Mr. Tenney. "He must be a remarkable teacher. I would like to see him and Laura together. He has probably found many ways to communicate with her other than through words. See if you can arrange a visit to the Bridgmans at a time when Mr. Tenney will be there also." The next week, on Thursday, Dr. Mussey and James Barrett drove together to the Bridgman farm. They arrived in the early afternoon, having been invited to remain for supper also. Mrs. Bridgman told them that Laura and Uncle Asa were out in the back meadow feeding the sheep. They walked around behind the big barn and looked across to the meadow. A flock of sheep was grazing there. "I don't want Mr. Tenney to think that we are spying on him," said James Barrett, "but I'm afraid that if he sees us right away, he'll just bring Laura back to the house and go home. There they are, do you see them?" "Yes, I see them," said Dr. Mussey. "Let's start over in their direction. Both of them have their backs to us and seem very busy with something. Perhaps they won't notice us for a bit." As they came closer, they could see that Uncle Asa had brought a pewter bottle of milk. He was taking it out of his jacket pocket. They watched as he gave it to Laura. She sat right down in the grass with it, and a young, still wobbly-legged little lamb came running over to her. The lamb went down on its knees in front of her. Laura popped the bottle of milk into its mouth. Even a child who can see and hear couldn't have more fun than that, said Dr. Mussey. They must have done this many times before. Laura knew just what to do. Let's go over there, James. I want to meet Mr. Tenney. Surely he won't go off and leave Laura feeding the lamb alone. James Barrett was not at all sure that Asa Tenney would not leave when he came into sight, but he took Dr. Mussey over anyway. Laura, busy with the lamb, did not notice their arrival in any way. Mr. Tenney, said James Barrett, I would like to introduce Dr. Mussey. He is one of my teachers at the college. I have told him a great deal about you and Laura. Uncle Asa did not look at all pleased at the arrival of a second stranger who was interested in Laura. It was bad enough having James Barrett watching Laura so much, and now he was bringing his friends to see her too. How do you do, he said quite gruffly. Laura's busy feeding an orphan lamb, as you can see. Dr. Mussey shook hands with Mr. Tenney, and then he asked, Why doesn't one of the other mother's sheep feed this baby? Sheep are funny that way, said Uncle Asa, forgetting to be unfriendly for a minute. They don't like to adopt another used baby, even if it is motherless. I didn't realize that, said Dr. Mussey. What kind of sheep are these? Uncle Asa's face began to brighten. This stranger seemed much more interested in farm animals than in Laura. After Laura had finished feeding the lamb, they went to the barn to gather eggs. Dr. Mussey wanted to know just what kind of hens they were and how many eggs they usually laid each day. When they visited the pigs, he wanted to know what the pigs had been fed to make them so fat so early in the year. In a very short time, Dr. Mussey and Asa Tenney were the best of friends. James Barrett went back to the farmhouse to do some of his regular work on Mr. Bridgman's papers. Uncle Asa and Laura and Dr. Mussey finished the chores, explored the woods at the edge of the meadow, and just generally had a fine time. Dr. Mussey didn't ask a single question about Laura, but that didn't mean that he wasn't interested in her or that he wasn't finding out a great deal. But he knew something that young James Barrett did not know. He knew that if he seemed to show no interest in Laura, Mr. Tenney would not feel frightened and uneasy. At the same time, because Laura was right there with them, Uncle Asa couldn't help but show Dr. Mussey some of his ways of teaching her. Dr. Mussey was also able to see that Laura and Uncle Asa had a kind of sign language that they used with each other. For example, a slight push meant that they were going somewhere. A pull meant that she wanted to show him something. If she raised her hand to her lips, it meant that she wanted a drink from the well. If she sat down as they were walking, it meant that she was tired and wanted to rest. There were many other signs that passed between Uncle Asa and Laura that a person less interested than Dr. Mussey might not have noticed. One thing was very clear to him. Laura was indeed a very bright little girl, and she could use her mind wonderfully well, in spite of being deaf, blind, mute, and almost without a sense of taste or smell. Before they sat down to supper, Dr. Mussey was able to carry out a few simple tests on Laura, about which he wrote a report sometime later. At the end of this report, he said, she was considered by her parents as unusually intelligent before her sickness, and is still so regarded by them. In a short time, Mrs. Bridgman called her family and the 3 guests to supper. Mr. Tenney, Dr. Mussey, and Mr. Bridgman were soon busily engaged in conversation. James Barrett had been careful to take a place next to Laura. As the others were talking, James took Laura's little hand and guided it over to something beside his plate. Laura's face brightened. James Barrett was helping her trace the spiral shape on a new snail shell one of her lost treasures had mysteriously returned. Then he placed something close to her other hand, the smooth, rounded end of a large section of a robin's egg. Again, a smile spread over Laura's face. Her second lost treasure was found. Little did Laura know how many hours James Barrett had spent when he should have been studying, looking under damp rocks for an empty snail shell and under apple trees for a section of an eggshell, thrown from the nest by some other busy mother robin. When the meal was over, he helped Laura put her treasures safely away in her boot. As Dr. Mussey and James Barrett rode back through the lush green New Hampshire countryside, Dr. Mussey said, "I have a plan, James. Let's see what comes of it." Chapter 6 is called Help Comes. Young Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe was sitting reading by a window in his apartment. For 5 years he had been the director of the first school for the blind in the United States. This school in Boston, Massachusetts, was called the New England Asylum for the Blind. It had been founded in 1829 by Dr. John D. Fisher. In 1832, Dr. Howe had been appointed the first director. In 5 years, he had seen the school grow from a few rooms in his own father's home, with just a handful of pupils, to a real school housed in a beautiful mansion, a gift from wealthy Colonel Thomas Perkins. Later, when the school was moved to even larger quarters in South Boston, it was renamed Perkins Institution. Moved again in 1912 to Watertown, Massachusetts, it is now known all over the world as Perkins School for the Blind. At this time, Dr. Howe was not married and lived with his unmarried sister, Miss Jeanette Howe, in a small apartment in the school. Miss Jeanette, as everyone called her, was busy sewing as Dr. Howe sat reading by the window. The cool June breeze felt refreshing to the tired young director who took his job so seriously. Suddenly he became very excited about something he was reading. "By Jove," he said aloud, "she sounds like just the child I have been hoping to find." "Who does?" asked Miss Jeanette, looking up from her sewing. "What child have you been hoping to find?" "There's a report here," said the young doctor, "written by my friend Dr. Reuben Mussey of Dartmouth College. It tells of a remarkable child who has recently been brought to his attention. She lives on a farm in the outskirts of Hanover. The child has been deaf, blind, mute, and practically without a sense of taste or smell since the age of 2. He reports quite fully about his visit to observe her in her home, and says that in spite of these many handicaps, she is an unusually alert and clever child." "What is her name?" asked Miss Jeanette. "Her name is Laura Bridgman. She is 7 years old and in good health. She does simple household tasks as well as chores about the farm. She even sews and knits with some skill. But most important of all, he says that she is as eager to learn and as curious about all that goes on around her as any normal 7-year-old. He wonders if perhaps she could not be educated." "Jeanette, you know how eager I have been to find a child like this and to experiment with some of my ideas about the education of the deaf-blind. I am sure that she is the one I should begin with." "But Sam," said Miss Jeanette, "don't you have enough to do now without attempting such a hopeless task? You know how unsuccessful they have been in the attempt to educate Julia Brace down in Hartford. She too is deaf, blind, and mute. She just doesn't seem to want to learn." "That is just the point," said Dr. Howe. "This child is eager to learn, according to Dr. Mussey's report. Her own curiosity and eagerness will be as important as anything I will be able to do. Don't forget, Julia Brace was nearly 30 years old when they attempted to educate her. 7 is a golden age for learning. I am determined to go to Hanover and see this child myself. If Dr. Mussey is right about her ability, and I know what a careful observer he is, I intend to seek her parents' permission to bring her here to the school in the fall." "Well, I only hope that you are not going to be disappointed, Sam," said Miss Jeanette. "I feel sure that I won't be," said Dr. Howe enthusiastically. "I'll write Dr. Mussey tonight and ask him to make arrangements for me to visit the little girl in July. Our school will be having vacation. I had thought of going to the graduation at Dartmouth then anyhow." It was an excited Dr. Mussey who, a few days later, reported to an equally excited James Barrett the arrival of a letter from the distinguished Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe. "He says," Dr. Mussey explained, "that there has never been a child as handicapped as Laura educated at his school. He says that to his knowledge, no deaf, blind, and mute person has ever been successfully educated anywhere. But he has been eager to try to educate just such a child. I think our Laura is going to have her chance." The very next day, Dr. Mussey made a visit to the Bridgman farm and received permission to bring Dr. Howe to see Laura in July. He explained that Dr. Howe was hopeful about the possibility of educating her at his school. Mr. and Mrs. Bridgman were most grateful to Dr. Mussey. They were realizing more acutely each day that unless something were done soon for their intelligent little daughter, she would become wholly unmanageable. But Dr. Mussey was not able to convince Asa Tenney that any good would come from Dr. Howe's visit. Uncle Asa was certain that he himself could teach Laura all that she would ever need to know. "Haven't I taught her to love the creatures of the woods and the flowers of the fields?" he asked Dr. Mussey. "She has waded in the brook in summer, slid on the ice in winter, and felt its power when it is swollen in the spring. She has raised lambs, learned to find the hidden nests of hens, and held newborn kittens and puppies in her hands. I have taught her in the only way that she can learn, through her hands. What can they teach her in a school? Teachers whom she cannot hear, using books that she cannot see. The great out-of-doors is the best schoolroom there is for any child, but even more so for Laura." "Yes, Asa," said Dr. Mussey, "what you have done for Laura is wonderful. Without your teaching, no other teacher would be able to do anything. You have kept alive her curiosity and eagerness to learn. You have given her wonderful experiences. But you yourself have seen what is happening more and more often now. She flies into a rage and is almost like a caged animal when she wants something but cannot make those around her understand what she wants." Asa Tenney looked uncomfortably down at the ground. He knew exactly what Dr. Mussey meant. Just a few days before, he and Laura had gone out to salt the sheep. Laura had wanted to feed the baby lamb a bottle of milk again. Uncle Asa had no way of telling her that the lamb had now grown too big and could feed itself. Determined little Laura had searched in every one of Uncle Asa's pockets for the bottle of milk, and, furious at not finding it, had reached up and caught hold of his glasses. She had torn them off his face and crushed them on the ground. "You do not want Mr. Bridgman to have to treat her like a dumb animal, whipping her if she will not obey him," said Dr. Mussey gently. "Dr. Howe believes that Laura can be taught to understand our words and to talk with us. Surely you, who have set her free this far, won't stand in the way of giving her even greater freedom." "Oh, I have nothing to say about it," said Asa Tenney in despair. "If Mr. Bridgman thinks that this Dr. Howe can make a blind child see, a deaf child hear, and a mute child talk, who am I to contradict him?" "He too will have to work through Laura's hands, Asa, just as you have," said Dr. Mussey. "These wonderful hands that you have helped to make so sensitive." But nothing that was said could convince Asa Tenney that sending Laura to school in Boston was going to be a good thing. And nothing would induce him to be on hand on the afternoon when the carriage with Dr. Mussey and Dr. Howe arrived at the Bridgman farm. Laura never forgot her first meeting with Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe. He was an unusually tall man, and she was just a little girl. His great height, combined with his great gentleness, made a lasting impression. When he took her small hand in his large one on that July afternoon in New Hampshire, there began an adventure in education that was to become famous all over the United States and parts of Europe. Even in the short visit that he made that day, Dr. Howe caught a glimpse of Laura Bridgman's unusual quickness and intelligence. Like James Barrett and Dr. Mussey before him, he was much impressed and knew that Laura Bridgman was the child with whom to carry on his first experiment in the education of the deafblind. As a result of the visit, it was agreed that Laura would go to Dr. Howe's school in the fall. That's where we're going to end for tonight. We will pick it up next time with Chapter 7. Have a good evening.